so it's good to actually have this opportunity here. And let me also say that I'm a trained anthropologist. That's what I am. So I used to distinguish trees between pinos and no pinos. So I mean, my ecological basis, let's say, it's weaker than most of the audience here, and I just want to put that up front. But in my team, it's always I always work with a lot of ecologists, environmental scientists, and people who actually know what they are talking about. And I think that the work that I'm going to be presenting today reflects precisely this interaction that Anna was saying, and how we can actually work together from the two sides if we are both ready to listen and to change some of the things we do. So the work I'm going to be presenting, the topic is on biocultural diversity and in the inextricable link between biological and cultural diversity. I'm going to be presenting works that comes from two different projects. One is a project funded by the BBVA Foundation, is a bank here in Spain, and the other one is an ERC that I held in the previous years. And it's a team. I'm going to be talking about the people who have actually done a lot of this work, but just to acknowledge that what I'm presenting is not my only work, it's the work of a big team behind. Okay, so let us move. What's this idea of biocultural diversity, what it is? In ecology, you talk about biological diversity, and in anthropology, we talk about cultural diversity. So one would think that when you talk about biocultural diversity is adding biological and cultural diversity, but this is not what it is, because as everyone who works in knowledge systems know, when you add two things together, it's more than the adding. There is a complexity that increased by the fact of adding two types of diversity together. So when we talk about biocultural diversity, we want to talk about all this diversity that is in human life, and that includes the biological diversity, the genes, the ecosystems, the whole habitats, but also the diversity in human systems, from socioeconomic, linguistic, religious, all this cultural diversity, and how these two diversities overlap and are linked one to each other and modify, how cultures modify the ecological environment and how the ecology also affect or interact with culture. So there are two I'm just gonna get my watch so I keep the time. But there are two important concepts that I'm gonna be talking about. One, through the lecture, one is this idea of traditional knowledge systems, and I don't know if you are familiar with that, but in anthropology or in the field, when we talk about traditional knowledge systems, we talk about this knowledge, beliefs, practices of people who have had a long interaction with the environment. So we are not talking about something that you newly created, but it's some kind of like construct that societies have managed to develop over time and pass one to another, and refer to the environment that is around them. And that's what they use to manage their environment, and that's how they have adapted to the environment. So this is a concept that I'm going to be talking a lot about that, and the important things to keep in mind is that it refers to, as I said, to knowledge. So these plants can be used for that, or that's how we cure, like ethnobotanical knowledge would be here, but also practices. How do you actually manage water in an ecosystem, right? And people might not be able to explain to you, but they just have some water channels and they know that where the water comes from, etc. And beliefs. And maybe in the later part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about beliefs. Beliefs are important because even if you think they don't represent a reality, people act based on their beliefs. So they actually modify or do things because they believe so, and this has a real impact on the environment. Important things is that this knowledge is co-evolve, so it doesn't depend only on the culture, it depends also on the ecosystem that this culture has around. It's shared, so it's not the knowledge of one person, it's the knowledge, what we mean, individual people also have different knowledge, separate one from the other, but by traditional knowledge we mean this system that is shared within a group. It's cumulative, so you pass it from one generation to the other and you build on other people's knowledge, and it's adaptive, and this is something that we anthropologists often forget. Knowledge changes as the environment around the society changes, knowledge also change. The other very important concept that I want you to kind of like keep in mind while I'm going to be giving the talk is this idea of cultural landscapes. And I'm scared to talk about that because I have an expert on the room, at least, I don't know the others, but Andre knows a lot about that. But it's this idea that we have landscapes that are the combined work of what the nature in that place is and the human kind, no? So even if we see nature, this nature has been modified somehow by the people who have been living in that place for a long time. And there are examples like the forest islands in the savannas of in Bolivia, or the dark earth or sacred forest, right? So all these are systems that might seem, or that have seemed to ecologists or to scientists in general, like wild nature, but in fact come from humans' modifications, or from the interactions between the place and the people. And one example, but maybe I don't need to go deep into that, is the Amazonian dark earth, which are these kind of anthropogenic soils that for a while people thought that this was another type of soil that it just spread in the Amazon, as you find red soils or sandy soils. But in fact now, with the archaeological records, they are finding that these are soils that are created that were created by people, not that were doing agriculture, slash and burn. Am I saying something wrong, Andre? No? Is that correct? Okay. So the other thing that that people who look at biocultural diversity is very keen at looking at is whether there is an overlap between biological diversity and cultural diversity. Is there more biological diversity where there is more cultural diversity? So I'm just going to show very briefly some work that has been done. It started in the 96, kind of this idea that, okay, there is an overlap. The areas, the biodiversity hotspots are also areas where there is a lot of cultural diversity. So for example, in this map, this guy tried to look at the places where there is a high diversity of languages and high diversity of vertebrates, no? And in red, he represented all the places where there is high diversity of both. So he was trying to argue, we have many places where there is high diversity of both types of cultural and biological. Another representation of that, a little bit more recent, it's by Rick Stepp. Someone here, it's a student of Rick Stepp, and he was trying to do to look at the same thing, but his proxy for cultural diversity were languages. So he just actually, every dot in the map represents a distinct language in the world, indigenous language or local language, and the colors, it's areas of plant diversity. So the argument is kind of the same. You have areas like Central America, the Andes, the Congo Basin, over there, Oceania, where you have a high overlap between cultural and biological diversity. These two diversities are not independent, they just come together. Or that's what they try to show with their maps. Other representation, more recent, 2012, same thing, the hotspot of biological diversity, and then the cultural diversity. You have the biodiversity hotspots and languages again. So another representation, the last one on this, it's just from this year, some months ago, in nature sustainability. There's this group of people who actually try to map the lands that are owned or that are under the custody of indigenous people. So they found that 28% of the world terrestrial surface is managed or owned by indigenous people. This representation does not include local communities, it's only people who call themselves indigenous. That's a lot, and a lot of these overlap with areas with high biological diversity. So again, the argument that there is an overlap between cultural and biological diversity. Okay, very nice, we all like that, but does this really, this is all global maps, no? And in global, you have some things that happen at global scales, but our question here in the lab, what we try to actually look at is like, do we see the same, how this association is seen when you look at the local level, which is what we anthropologists and maybe some of the ecology. Oh, well, I forgot that slide. So on this overlap, the explanation that people who look at biocultural diversity gives is that because every culture has a different way of interacting with nature, and you develop a system of interactions, you increase diversity. So the overlap is not, it can be casual, right? The rainforest in the Amazonian, no one has destroyed the cultural diversity and the biological diversity because these are isolated places, right? It's hard for the global forces to actually get there to interfere with the global, with the cultural and with the biological. That could be an explanation, but the explanation that it's given here, it's also that there is an increase in the cultural diversity that comes by the fact that you have different groups, societies, managing the ecosystems. So, we were trying, our question in the lab, and that's what the work that we actually have done, is to look at this kind of overlap or this interaction between cultural diversity and biological diversity more at the local level. And we built on this idea that when you actually manage an ecosystem, you can actually increase the biodiversity of these ecosystems. So I'm going to be presenting in two different cases. The first one refers to the Punnan Tubu. The Punnan Tubu are a group that were nomadic until like maybe the 50s or so, and after the 50s have started to be sedentarized by the Indonesian policies. They live in Borneo, in Kalimantan, and yeah, they were hunter-gatherers until recently they settled down, and they still live a lot on the forest. They are forest dependent, but they now have some rice and cassava cultivations, right? But like, just for example, it took me 1 week to get there, right? It's like 3 days in canoe, 1 day walking, and so it's really like they live in the middle of the forest, although you see them with this, all this is the effect of the Indonesian state, but it's really, they live really in the middle of the forest, although my spies tell me that there is a logging road plan on the area for soon. But okay, so what did we do? We measure things in the two sides. We measure things on the biological side and on the more social side. For the social side, we were interested in forest use. So how do the Punnan interact with the forest? How do they use it? What do they do? What we did was we had interviews asking people what they do, but we also give GPS to people. So when they went out for their activities, like this guy, he was hunting, he had his spur, he was spur hunting. So in the morning, we'll say, oh, you are going hunting, just take this GPS. So he will just carry the GPS with him on his back, right? And so we did that with a number of adults, so we can map the actual use of the forest. And on the biological side, we use, Max, who is the researcher who did this actual research, he measure tree diversity and species use using plots in different areas and sample identification of the species. So standard botanical methods. Okay, what did we find? So we found the tracks show that there is a high use of the area, right? So all these areas that seem to be maybe not occupied or not very used, they are indeed used. In this map, what we show is, in this map we show like the paths that they follow, but we also measure the time that you stay. So it's not only if you pass, but also like if you go hunting, you stay for a little while in one spot, or if you go cultivation, you stay in a, so the use of the space, it's different depending on how much time you actually spend there. So there were many places, right, that there is not only a path, but there is also like a presence that can be quantified or seen, right? And then we also look at the actual use depending on, I mean, we have four main activities. What was it? Well, this is all together with this is hunting, the collection of rattan, which is kind of, well, you know what's rattan, and non-commercial logging. So how these activities are spread in the space, right? So some of the activities like hunting, these columns indicate when it's closer and farther from the village, right? So some of the activities are closer, some of the activities take place in a more wide range, right? And then, well, these are kind of like the results separate, right? The uses, and this is the results of the plots. So we have these floristic patterns and inventories, and don't start asking me about the details of this because I'm not bad. We record all these 5,000 individual in the 20 plots, I think that he did. There was a very high diversity of species. There were some species with a high ecological value. We found that the diversity found in the two villages where we were working was kind of different. So there is some analysis here on the biological thing, and then we try to put everything together, right? What happened, how these diversity indices, this variation on the different plots, how do that relate to the tracks? So when people come across, I mean, does the diversity that you find in a place is somehow affected by the use that people do, measure with these paths? And basically what we found is that use of a space increases diversity up to a threshold when it actually starts decreasing. So the actual use that people might do, and then if we go back to the here, no, like the actual different uses, you could imagine that when you start doing logging, the diversity becomes kind of like it starts decreasing. No? I mean, the effect that you have on the ecosystem might actually result in a decrease of the diversity. But at to certain point, the actual use of the ecosystem, the actual plugging flowers or like eating when on your way on the path, or the actual, no, there is a generation, or it's an increase. You modify the environment in a way that allows more diversity to be there, which actually goes together with this line that I was presenting at the beginning about how cultural diversity and biological diversity go together, no, are linked. We look at whether this was especially true for edible trees, and we found kind of like the same pattern, but the signal was kind of like not that strong. So I'm not gonna make a big point of that. So the conclusion for this first part, I will say that it's that the management that people do, although it's a management, it's a very relative concept, right? Because people are not, you wouldn't say that they are managing, they're just passing, they're just going hunting or rattan collection, and on their way, they are modifying. They might build a little hut to wait for the prey. So, but this is not actual management in the sense of like, okay, they are cutting to a plot. But this small management actually have some effect in the forest composition, but not on the structures. But then there was all this issue of like, to a certain point, right? After a certain point, you are not actually creating diversity, you are just actually going on the downside of the curve. So that will be one of the projects. The other one relates to the same relationship, but we were looking at the issue of loss of diversity, right? So because if you say, okay, when you have more biological diversity, you have more, if you have more cultural diversity and biological, they go together. So the question is, okay, now we know that there is this big loss of biological diversity. Is it related? I'm not going to be talking about causal relation, but is there a relation? I mean, are they linked? When you lost cultural diversity, you are also losing biological, or vice versa. So that was the second study. And these results, this case study we collected among, this data we collected among the Chimane. The Chimane are an indigenous population in the Bolivian Amazon. They have been hunter-gatherers, the same story kind of, until the 50s when the missioners start arriving, the schools, the national programs start sedentarizing them. They live a lot out of fishing more than hunting, but they also do hunting, and they live a lot on the natural environment. That's the place where I have done my Ph.D. research, and in the 99 when I arrived there, some people have never, everyone was going hunt with bow and arrows, and people, you still have like these people that have not seen a mirror and these things that anthropologists like to tell. So they were quite on the margins of the systems. They also live in a forest very well preserved, terra firme. Okay, so in that project we did a couple of things, but one of the things, the base of the project was on this participatory mapping. So the base of the project was this idea that their forest is kind of preserved, but there is forest concession around, and they wanted kind of to take their territory. So we were helping them to map their territory so they could defend it with maps, say, this is the area that we use. So we wanted to help them to actually show where are they doing their activities, where do they go hunting, where do they go for wild plant collections, etc. So we did that in 32 of the, this is half of the Chimanes communities. The first more descriptive analysis shows that these are the different villages where we work, and this is the distance that people walk to actually do their activities. So villages that are very isolated, not isolated, but like farther from the market town, so they live more on the margins, do a more extensive use of their lands. Villages who are close to the town, they actually do agriculture just around their different areas. So this is how do people use the resources around them. We also map that, and here you can see how the different uses, how some of this is the river, this is the main river where the communities are settled. The main town is around here, and then in this you have like which space is used by the different communities. So we did this work with them because, as I was saying, this here shows the territory, and here are logging concessions that are trying to get into their land, and we were trying to help them to show that their use of the space was even below their limits, and that they need this space to actually keep way of life that they use. No? But this was kind of like the project, the kind of like the political side of the project, but we also had all these other measurements that I'm going to be telling you about now. No? So basically, for this descriptive part of the project, we found that villages that are close to the town have a more limited use of space, it's more restricted, and they specialize in the extraction of thatch palm, which is some commercial product, and then agriculture. And villages that are far from the town have a very more extensive use of the space, and it's based on subsistence activities like hunting, etc. And now we know that this also has an impact on the ecosystem, right? With the Punan case study. So it's not to say that they don't affect, and they do affect. They just have different impacts on the systems that they are using. So here, to answer this question on whether there is a relation between the loss of one and the loss of other, we also collected two types of data. The project here, it's different from the other in the sense that in the other we have two villages and we have individual measures. In this one, we have village measure. Our unit of analysis, which was bigger, was the whole territory. So for example, we measure things at the landscape scale. So at the landscape, one of the measures we had was satellite images. So we actually took images from, I think, 86 was the first years to 2011, I think, was the last image, and we actually measured change, how many deforestation, and all this analysis, land use, land cover, classification, fragmentations, habitat loss, etc. And we calculated for each village, we calculated around this village in a 5 kilometers radius, how much fragmentation there was, how much conversion to pasture. So we have this different information for the 32 villages on the landscape change. On the cultural side, that's a little bit more tricky, because how do you actually measure cultural change in 32 villages? So what we do, we did these surveys on indicators of things that show cultural acculturation, let's say. For example, Spanish fluency. This is a population where only 30% of the people actually speak Spanish, and these are the males who live close to town. The rest of the people speak their own language, Chimane. So the more Spanish fluency, the more acculturated, the cultural loss. Level of education, the same. Missionaries have only reached to certain villages, so the farther you are into the forest, you are going to have, the more educated you are more distant to your culture in this context. Visit to the market town, and wage labor. So all these are indicators that in the contents show loss of their own cultural values. So we did these surveys at the individual level. These are 500 surveys on this. This project took a poor student, he wanted to kill me, 18 months of field work. Like, only returning information to the villages took us 3 months, the actual telling them, because every village was one day in canoe. They spent all their days doing the surveys and then traveling, and so it was quite intensive. So we did all this in these 32 villages at the individual level and generate village level variables to be able to find something at the landscape level, because here you have diversity, loss of biological diversity measured at the landscape level, right? This village lost so much land, and we wanted to say this village has this level of cultural change or acculturation. So we have to go through this individual data collection aggregated to the villages and actually measure cultural change and economic change. So we did the land use classification and how actually, where are the places where you are losing, where is more forest fragmentation, etc. I'll show you another map now, but just for you to remind that these are our villages. This is the market town, so there are villages downriver, there is villages upriver. All these villages is where we were working. That's where probably you have like the most deforested or land changes. And there is a logging road here, and some of the other Timane villages are also set in some of these logging roads. So, okay. Here is the results for this, San Borja, right, and the river. So in this map, we can see the Spanish, right? So how much our variable was fluency on Spanish. And here it's like a percentage, no? The bigger is this dot in the center of the figure, the more Spanish people speak. So smaller dots is less acculturated people who, with this measure. And the colors is this fragmentation measure, no? The core area index, right? So you kind of see a correlation here, like where you have more loss of cultural diversity, you seem to have also more fragmentation. I think the other, it's kind of like the same, but with market integration measured with the wage labor, where people go more to wage labor, you have an overlap with areas that are also more fragmented. And here you have kind of like the same idea, or the same kind of measurements, no, with different measures of ecological diversity, let's say, and with a different measure of cultural diversity. In this case, we measure traditional ecological knowledge, the concept that I told you at the beginning. So I actually design, that's what I know how to do in life, design tests, kind of like an exam, to measure the level of traditional knowledge of people in a culture. So it's kind of like asking people what's their ethnobotanical knowledge, and actually seeing who has more knowledge than other people in the same group. So we also find that in villages, this is not individual measures, right? You measure individuals, and then you say this class has more knowledge than the class of the last year or the next group, no? So this village has more or less knowledge than the other, and how this correlate with the fragmentation or with the different old-growth forest covers or shape complexity, all these ecological measures that we also come from the landscape. And again, we find the same results. There is an overlap. I'm not saying there is a what causes what. I'm just saying there is an overlap between villages that have less traditional knowledge. They also happen by chance to have lower diversity, not by chance, but they have lower indices in this old-growth forest, fragmentation, these ecological measures. We did the same thing, not the same, but we did also, so part of this project was the mapping, another part was the classification of landscapes, another part was plots. I'm not presenting the plots because I have presented the plots for the other project. And the third part, and that's where Joan Pino, who is in the CREAF, we were directing a PhD thesis of a girl Anna Luz, who did this work. So she actually did transects for animal diversity. So he did, like, I think 80 transects or something like that in all these 32 villages. So she was actually able to provide a measure of mammal diversity, game diversity was in the area. And one of the interesting things she found is that when you look at the diversity of animals, and then when you look at the profiles of hunters, you have, she was trying to look at how this, like, hunting affects or doesn't affect the diversity, no? And one of the things that she found is that there are two types of hunting. So there are the hunters that actually are subsistence hunting for their livelihood, and they target, they have a very diversified profiles. I think these are these first two groups. They have a very diversified profile. They just hunt a little bit of everything. But then there are these other type of hunters who are very much more specialized, and they just target some very specific species, ungulates and primates, and they have a much more, let's say, impactful impact on the diversity of these species, because they are also less resilient, no, in this context. So basically, we do find very significant and strong associations between forest conservation and traditional knowledge, or this loss of diversity. And we, from this last result in hunting, we kind of like conclude that this contact with society, no, with the mainstream society, the fact that you are now selling your hunting, you are specializing in these species to actually sell part of it, affect the hunting patterns and affects the diversity in the area. So basically, economic and cultural transformations, no, are also mediating on changing the landscapes and the diversity that is there. So just to close up a little bit, just to say that if there is this link between cultural diversity and biological diversity, we should be able to bring people to the actual goal. Like if our goal is to keep diversity there, it makes sense to bring actually people to the conservation. So we should not be talking about conservation of biodiversity, but we should be maybe thinking on conservation of biocultural diversity, conserving the ways that actually people manage their forests, people interact with their forests. And in fact, if we look at the conservation kind of evolution, there has been a switch, you know, in trying to bring people to conservation and to have partnerships with them, no? So in a way, we should be moving from this idea of wilderness, no, and areas that are pristine and we need to protect them, to be thinking more of like how all this nature that is out there is not wild, is cultural landscape, and how we can use the local management. And I'm not going to argue that all local management has a good effect, but there are, you know, and our studies at least shows that local management can actually increase and are the ones that creating these cultural landscapes, no? So how do we move from this area to actually bring people and recognize that what we want to conserve out there sometimes, or most times, are cultural landscapes that come from the management that people has done. And our kind of like our work is in this direction. And I think that was it. Thank you.
About the use of the concept of cultural diversity. If you consider the urban ecosystem, for example, you can divide it in plots and make a map of cultural diversity using, for example, the number of economical activities in each plot. What relation exists between this idea of cultural diversity and what you explained?
Right, but I will say that the concept of cultural diversity is like the concept of biological diversity, right? Some people talk about biological diversity and they talk about genes, and some people use the same concept and talk about ecosystems, right? So when we use the concept of cultural diversity, it's kind of like the same mess, no? Like in the maps I have presented, some people are using linguistics, number of differentiated languages, and I'm using measures of ethnobotanical knowledge. So in a sense, this concept should be defined, or I use the concept like big, but in the same way that we use biological, but indeed, at the end, you need to actually look at the measure at this in the specific case. For example, in these cases, there was no point of measuring linguistic diversity because it's a small scale, in the same way that if you want to do an ecosystem analysis, you are not measuring genes, no? So cultural diversity has also, it can go from local to global. I don't know if I'm answering. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this concept can be messy because we use it in different ways. Yeah.
More questions?
Well, I have more curiosity. I mean, I don't know, maybe you mentioned during the talk and I missed it, but what about the pressure? Like the anthropic pressure, because I guess this affects also the way the landscape is changed, no? Because, in the end, it's somehow, I don't know how we can actually change from, the idea you provide about changing from a total conservation of natural resources to a more managed. But I guess this depends on the anthropic pressure as well, right?
You mean like loggers there, or
the actual number of people?
Oh, the actual number of people. Oh, of course. Yeah. I mean, this is and as I say, we should not say that because they are indigenous people, they are managed. And there are many cases through history where people have destroyed their lands, right? So what I'm saying is that what can recover from this management that can actually use or be helpful for the management of the ecosystem, as we know. And certainly the point of population increase, it's a big issue because technology, for example, with the Chimane, I'm just thinking of the Chimane, right? It's not the same going hunting with bows and arrows than with rifles. And it's just clear. And it's not the same to be 5,000 Chimanes in their territory than to be 15,000. So there is, so in that sense, it's clear that it's not because they are indigenous they conserve, and it's not because they're indigenous it should keep. I'm just arguing how we can bring what it works, no? In the same way that conservation not always work, traditional knowledge not always work. So how can we bring the best from what can recover from that? And acknowledging that in changing conditions, what might have worked might not work, what might work for 10 might not work for 20, right? This is a very important point also, but it's also something that you can discuss with them, no?
But you looked at this,
No, we didn't. No, but it could be
villages that you looked at where they're different in terms of number.
The population pressure, yeah.
System, looking at the forest diversity, sometimes the very the easiest approach is the species richness, the number.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you would associate it to the different parameters you measure.
Yeah.
No. Number.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I don't think we have looked at that. That's a good point. Thanks. Maybe someone. Yeah. The thing. It's not. We haven't done it because we didn't thought, but it's true that it's a number that it's hard to get, no? Population. But that's, many things are hard to get and we get them. That's not we didn't thought of that.
I have one question more about the methodology of how do you actually generate the cultural biodiversity variables, through what kind of process you decided to use the fluency in Spanish or the education level to kind of form this group of variables to test it.
Right. This project started 10 years after I have been working in the area, right? So I started my work there in the 1990s. So over time, we kind of wash out variables and have tested a number of different variables and what actually measure what we wanted to measure, because Spanish fluency in itself, or fluency in the national language, that is not always a good proxy for cultural change, right? You can have people who is bilingual in many areas it's not. But in this context, so I will say that this, if you ask me how did you figure out these variables, there was a lot of testing, and then we actually we test the variables one with each other, so we correlated, no? And it's people who are more wage dependent also speak more Spanish, and they have more education, so we actually did some tests to actually see whether all these variables move in the same direction, and we use them as this proxy of cultural change. and they also are correlated against, this is from previous studies, against traditional knowledge, no? So people who have more traditional knowledge have less schooling, work less for wage labor, know less Spanish. So, but this is something that comes from long-term research in the area.
My question also goes a bit more on the philosophical side and perhaps the implications of it. So you use the argument that since management increases diversity, this means that in order to conserve, we also need people there, kind of, in a very simplistic way. But wouldn't that be also a conservationist argument? I mean, in the sense that you are focusing on diversity, right? Which is something very much appreciated by conservationists to justify the presence of people in conservation. And what about the cases in which diversity is actually reduced? Should people not be part of conservation?
Right. I hate this guy. He's in my team. He always have the hard questions. No, I mean, people might have a right to might have a say on how their lands are managed, and that's like, for example, in the I'm in the IPBS, in the how you call it, for biodiversity and intergovernmental panel. So I'm in that, and I'm in the task force for indigenous knowledge. So we are actually trying to bring indigenous people into the biodiversity and ecosystems, and so we hold these workshops with some indigenous people from different places, and they say, guys, we are just tired of you telling us we are helping, we can keep our lands because we are helping in conservation. It's like we want to keep them even if we don't help in conservation. This is our lands, and we are not telling you where you should build your roads, so why do you? So in a sense, answering your question, I personally do believe that if it's their land, they might have a say on that. But I also believe that dialogue can bring us together, right? It's like, so not imposing them a protected area, but not also kind of like doing nothing. So there must be a way in which there is a negotiation that can happen where they can keep part of their lands and maybe change some of the things they are doing, and we kind of like bring them to the idea that the conservation, I don't know, I mean, there must be, so I do think they have rights over their land, even if they want to destroy it, but I think that we have also a way to, a stake to say, guys, let's work together, no? So, yeah.
Because I mean, I'm still struggling with this, because I guess this is the case, like, this could be the case of, the study cases that you showed, like where you have indigenous people living. But think about natural parks. I mean, in that case,
think about
natural, like the parks that you showed in the States, or maybe parks in Europe. I mean, the idea there is to actually preserve, so to make sure that you don't have a high anthropic pressure.
Yeah.
Meaning that you can go, of course, you can visit, you can do your hike and enjoy the landscape, but then the idea is to actually, preserve it rather than
but Europe it's
like the people going and
but I mean, no, I see the point, but you have to think that in many of the parks in Europe, when the park was set, Doñana, let's say, okay, we're going to preserve that. They wanted to preserve a cultural landscape, right? And if you don't keep the management, 50 years after, you have a different ecosystem of what you wanted to preserve. And I'm not saying that people, if you have left people there, they would have keep managing, because of course people would have mechanized their agriculture, blah, blah, blah. But just acknowledging that when you say, I'm going to put a park here, in Europe, all these parks are set to preserve cultural landscapes, because those landscapes are not there just by nature without human intervention. They have been I mean, what is there, and this is what I was trying to show with the Punan, people use those, and what you find there, it's a product of the nature there and what people have done there. And I agree, I mean, and I do believe that if they have not put the park, this thing might have been destroyed, because then people would have got tractors and But this is independent to acknowledging that what we were trying to preserve was a cultural landscape. And if we completely take that out, at the end we are preserving something that is different of what we intended. Because when we set the walls there, that area had been managed in Europe for, I don't know, 10,000 years. In Europe, you don't have areas that have not been managed, or maybe north in. You see what I mean? And it doesn't mean that I'm saying you should have keep the people, because the people change in the same way that the ecosystems change. And I do think that if the parks have not been set in some of the contexts, we might have destroyed some of this. But it's not, this is not contrary to say that what we were trying to preserve was what people had created. Do I make sense? Not so much? I don't know.
I mean, I guess it's just I see things in a different way.
Yeah.
But do you think these local patterns lead to global patterns in biodiversity, or indeed you think that cultural diversity is a product of terrestrial primary production? You know?
Cultural diversity is a product of the...
Because it's also a product of evolution.
Right.
Because in the Amazonian forest, where you have more diversity of habitats, you might expect more diversity of culture.
But, I mean, that's the point. Is it you have more diversity of habitats and then you have more diversity of cultures, or is it co-evolve? So when I have given this talk sometimes before, like people have challenged me, oh, you are showing, you are trying to show determinism. People are creating this diversity, and I'm saying and I try to always say, okay, I'm talking about overlap, because we cannot actually show causality. Is diversity in culture creating diversity in biology, or is the other way around? So I will say the same argument here. We can show overlap, and these people who have worked at a global scale, the maps that I showed at the beginning, seem to be showing that there is this overlap. Now, whether this is there is a causal relationship that goes in one direction and the other, I don't think this field of biocultural diversity is old enough to have been able to show causality. We are only, like, people have been working on this idea in the last 20 years, right? When did ecology started? Like centuries.
Our species disappears, probably.